Okay, so we are going to begin. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar on mental health in the wake of COVID-19. Next slide, please. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Kati, and I'm the project coordinator of the center and will be facilitating the webinar today. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen. I will also enter this link in the chat box for you to sign up if it's easier for you. Next slide, please. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next couple of days. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you. Please use the chat feature to answer these questions. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor McCants-Katz is serving as SAMHSA Assistant Secretary. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA, for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now let's begin our webinar. We have PJ Wenger with us today. PJ has 29 years of experience working in the field of mental health. She has spent considerable time in a variety of settings developing her counseling practice. These settings include psychiatric emergency, inpatient treatment with both adults and children, in-home counseling for mental health issues, residential treatment, schools, and private practice. In the school setting, PJ Wenger has worked at the elementary, middle school, and high school level. In addition to this experience, PJ has been a trauma responder at the local, state, and national level. She has responded to large events like 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy, as well as traumatic events that affect schools such as suicides, traumatic deaths of staff, students, and homicide. PJ is licensed by the New Jersey State Board of Family and Health Practitioners and is a certified member of the National Board of Certified Counselors. She has a master's in counseling and an EDS in marriage and family therapy. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to PJ. Welcome, PJ.
Thank you, Katty. Welcome to everybody. Good morning. We're gonna get started. I just want to sort of start with what the state of mental health is right now in the face of this COVID-19, and what I term this as is we have the perfect storm for mental health. This is some statistics that are coming in as surveys are being done. And this is a Kaiser poll from April, which showed that these are among some of the statistics, but showed that 56% of Americans are reporting at least one negative effect on mental health. And that 65% of frontline healthcare workers and families have negative mental health effects related to COVID. So we see these numbers, they're pretty high. And this was a poll that was done over the internet with adults. So we're not even getting some of the figures for children. But if you see the figures for adults, we have a 78% increase in anxiety. I would say that that is probably the same or higher for our youth. The children that I'm seeing in my practice are expressing a great deal of anxiety. Some of that is coming from their parents' anxiety. Some of that is coming from their own. People are very stressed out for a number of reasons, and we're going to cover some of that. Difficulty sleeping, people are reporting they're lonely. This statistic covers a lot of adults, and we know that the elderly who experienced a great deal of loneliness before are experiencing some of that more, as is our younger population, who typically thrives on being together. I know when COVID started in the second part of the school year last year, that people thought that teenagers would really be okay because they spend most of their time on the phone and texting. And what we found is that they also really need that in-person connection. We're seeing a 65% report having more depression, prescriptions, that's what that RX stands for. Prescriptions for anxiety and antidepressants have increased, a great deal of financial worries. And we know that substance abuse and addiction has increased, although we don't have some of those figures at this moment. We do know that sale of alcohol went up. I believe wine sales went up 117% and beer sales went up 55%. And we're hearing from, colleagues and people in the field that individuals who are in recovery are having a great deal of difficulty sustaining that recovery. So again, if children are in these households where adults are experiencing this, they are exposed to this, and if they have some pre-existing conditions, it can make it a little worse. So just so we're kind of getting a picture of what mental health, the state of mental health is right now. So student experiences is really what we're going to talk about today. And students are experiencing a great deal of these factors that I've listed here. So definitely there is some trauma going on, and some of that trauma may be from being in homes that have someone who has a substance abuse issue or mental health issue. It could also be homes that are experiencing domestic violence. And we know that in the US right now, there's been a 35% increase in domestic violence calls to the police, as well as an increase in the intensity of the violence. Domestic violence shelters are overtaxed, which decreases the options for escape for some of these families. So again, children who are living in these homes, we're not seeing every day. And that was one of the advantages of the educators and the school system, is that because you saw children every day, you were able to recognize some of the signs and symptoms. And right now we're not seeing that. There's some psychological trauma. Children are experiencing some of that from the results of COVID, feeling shut in, feeling disconnected, again, feeling like they've lost a lot of things. There's children who have had deaths in their family, or relatives or friends close to them have had deaths. And of course, we're all aware that we are not having our normal rituals around death and dying at the moment, so it is more difficult. The isolation factor for our students is really critical. And although they are trying to connect, and we do see some youth out there getting together in person, there are many more youth whose families are being very conservative in terms of what they will allow their children to do. And so that is creating some isolation. And initially, I think the youth were very comfortable with using the social media, but as one of my youth said the other day, he feels like every day is rinse and repeat, he called it. So he said it's the same thing. And although he's talking to his friends, it's not the same, and he's feeling very isolated. Our youth are certainly feeling a lot of fear and anxiety. Until schools actually pronounced that they were going to go remote for the beginning of school, we had schools that were going hybrid or in person, and youth were very anxious about how they were going to maintain safety. when they got back to school, especially with all the things that are in the news about schools that did go back in person and then as a result had some outbreaks of the virus. The perception of threat, how threatening are people around me to me, how threatening is the virus. Sometimes youth go in and out of, yes, I can't get it, to yes, I can get it. So there's a lot of uncertainty for youth about the future. So last year, our seniors who were graduating lost a lot of the ritualistic events that they typically look forward to in their final year. This year, our juniors going into the senior year are what we call anticipating that they're going to be losing some of these things. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how things are going to go. Even I know that some of the schools were going to do a hybrid program and at the last minute changed over to a remote, completely remote. And now, some of those dates keep moving. We're going to do this till the middle of, October. We're going to do it till the end of October. So those dates keep changing. Right now, there's 21 million people out of work. So the unemployment rate has grown to 13.3% unemployment, which is the highest rate since the Great Depression. And as of April, 42% of adults report that they or their partner or both of them have lost jobs, taking cuts in salaries or hours, and that 28% have fallen behind in bills. So again, if you're living in a family who's experiencing that, there is a lot of uncertainty. And of course, reduced activities. Children thrive on their activities, especially the younger ones who are used to doing summer camps and summer, Bible classes and doing their soccers and their sports and those things. That's all sort of been taken away, although some areas are starting to do that. Family stressors. We talked about the domestic violence rates and families that are out of work or having difficulty paying their bills. If a child is living in a home where a parent has a mental illness, those mental illnesses are being exacerbated. We are aware of that. There's economic hardship, which again, children usually aren't exposed to that, but because they're home all the time and everybody's quarantined and everybody's so closely, they're hearing all those conversations and they're hearing the concerns of the adults that are around them. If a child is in a home where there is abuse and neglect, there is no one sort of watching out for them right now. Because the people who would be watching out for them or identifying that or making reports to Child and Protective Services is the school, and they're not in the school. And yes, children would be gone for the summer anyway. We would not be seeing them, but our interaction, our connection with children ended way before the actual school year ended last year. If there's complicated or traumatic bereavement, if they've lost a loved one and we're not able to see them, I know that I have several clients who've lost a grandparent or a parent, and due to the circumstances, they were permitted to go to the funerals when they were outside, but there was no viewing, they weren't able to say their goodbyes. So there's a lot of grief that's kind of been suspended and is affecting people. Certainly the racial inequities and the climate that we're experiencing in that area around the world, around the states at least, is certainly affecting children. So we have to be aware that all of these things that sometimes we think children aren't necessarily experiencing, they definitely are. So we want to talk about trauma a little bit. And when we talk about trauma, we really are talking about the effects of an event or a series of events or circumstances that may pose a threat or a physical or psychological harm to a person and is threatening. These events and circumstances may occur as a single occurrence or repeatedly over time. And so how the individual experiences these events and the circumstances helps to determine whether it is a traumatic event. And so we really need to identify if our students are experiencing trauma, if they're stressed out, if they're just having a pre-existing mental illness that is being exacerbated by what's going on. But we do know that trauma affects us in many, many different ways. And these are some of the ways that trauma affects us, biologically, emotionally, behaviorally, cognitively, physically, interpersonally, and in our perceptions of the world. And so when we talk about these things, we really have to be able to pick up some of these signs. And because we're remote, I tell educators we really need to be the detectives now. We really need to be watching children a little more carefully and really taking our knowledge of trauma and stress and figuring out the status of our students. And we're going to talk about how we can assess students if in fact we are not doing an opening school screening. So many of my schools are asking for screening assessments that they can do that will give them information on the status of the children at this moment. So understand that there are three types of trauma. The first one is acute, which is a single traumatic event, which could be a physical or sexual assault. There is chronic trauma, which is multiple and varied events like domestic violence or community violence. And then there's complex trauma, which is interpersonal traumatic events that happen from a young age. So they include emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and again, if children are in a home where there's helpful adults or caring adults are not seeing them, they may be experiencing these things on an ongoing basis. So we're just going to talk about for a minute the different ways that trauma affects our brain. So the physical structure of the brain is dynamic. The brain structure interacts with brain functioning. So what we see in children who have been traumatized, and this is a picture of two brains. The brain on the left is the brain from a normal child without trauma. The brain on the right is from a 3-year-old child who experienced sensory deprivation and neglect from birth to 3. And you can see the difference. And this is not photoshopped or any of those kinds of things. These are 2 3-year-olds, and you can see the actual difference in the size of the brain. And a smaller brain size means a lower IQ. We have, smaller intracranial volume. Basically, that's the size of the brain. You're looking right at it. We can see the holes in the brain on the right. And again, that's not normal brain development. And so we have smaller corpus callosum, and that is just the part of the brain that connects the right brain and the left brain. So think about that part being so small that maybe there's not connection. There are physiological changes. So children who are traumatized and operate from a trauma place, actually their brain is typically seen in what we see in Alzheimer's patients. So a brain scan of a child who's been traumatized and a brain scan of an older person who has Alzheimer's may look very similar because there's a lot of atrophy in the brain, which causes developmental delays and memory. So if you think of somebody with Alzheimer's, they have memory lapses, they have organizational problems, they can't sequence, they can't figure out what to do next, they sort of lose track of what they're doing. And a child who is physically abused can have the same kind of brain. So again, these are real biological changes that happen in a child's brain that we need to be aware of. So if we're asking them to remember things, if we're asking them to organize, they're unable to do that because their brain is actually changing based on the trauma they're experiencing. We have emotional effects of trauma. Trauma causes fear, and not just fear of people or places or things, but children may be having intrusive memories that are going on during the day, and we may not even know that. Or they may be having nightmares at night and they're not sleeping. But children will experience the same reactions when exposed to the reminders of the traumatic event as they do when they were actually exposed to the traumatic event. So for instance, if a child was in a car accident and the car accident was really bad and it was very traumatic for them, on a day when the sun is shining and the roads are dry and everything is clear and they're driving by that same area, they may experience the same fear that they did after the accident. And again, it's a trigger, but it certainly affects how they're functioning. We see sadness and depressive symptoms, and again, that may arise in response to this abrupt loss of trust, because when children have a traumatic event in their lives, they sometimes lose trust in the people and the adults in the world around them. They may have suicide ideation because they're trying to get rid of the pain. They may do self-injury behaviors because they're trying to feel. So again, these are all some of the emotional effects of trauma. We definitely see anger. And again, the anger may be manifested in non-compliance. We may see rages or tantrums. They may be physically aggressive with peers, or they may break things. They may break property. And the anger really is coming from that they have all these feelings and fears and anxieties around things that remind them of traumatic events, and they don't know how to express them. So it makes them angry because it's so frustrating for them. They have, regulation problems, sometimes severe. They don't know how to handle their emotions. They don't have words for their emotions. They have difficulty expressing themselves, and this all leads to dysregulation. There certainly is anxiety. Fear certainly causes anxiety for children who are traumatized. So for instance, in a classroom, when a teacher raises their voice, if the caretaker in their home who is abusive yells a lot, that is going to startle a child and put them into a defensive mode. And we're gonna see how that brain works in a little bit. And then children who suffer trauma really do have a negative self-image, because they often think that the event was their fault if they had done something differently. Children will often say, if I had done my homework, my dad would not have been mad, and then he wouldn't have hit my dad. So again, they really take responsibility for some of the things that are happening around them that they really have no responsibility for. There's some behaviors, and when we talk about these are some of the things that we see in the classroom. I often tell educators, children's behavior is for one of two reasons. It's to get something or to avoid something. So we have to figure out what that is. And avoidance is thoughts, people, places, situations that trigger, recollection of their traumas or their experience. So, for instance, sometimes if you're asking children to get in a circle and hold hands, that might be really hard for a child who comes from sexual abuse, because touch has a very negative connotation for them. So for them to actually be physically close to another individual is very hard for them. And again, if we're not on top of some of these things, we may not be aware of them. And children tend to avoid what is traumatic to them. So for instance, if a boy or a girl or child is molested in a shower at school, they may begin to avoid gym class, or they may begin to avoid the shower. And then eventually that will cross over to their home life, and they will begin to stop showering. And again, parents respond to that by yelling at a child, why aren't you showering? It's unclean, you have poor hygiene, and in fact, we've missed that something traumatic has happened, and the child is actually avoiding the shower because it brings back so many bad memories. So again, modeling. We see in kindergarten, when kindergarten kids come to school, we see sometimes children hit other children, and we wonder, why are they doing that? But sometimes children who grow up in abusive homes observe and learn these maladaptive behaviors and coping strategies. And so it is what they know. We're going to talk a lot about modeling and how children see us and how they model after us. Traumatic bonding. This is the Stockholm syndrome. Oftentimes, I'm sure maybe in your years of being in schools, you have seen this where you've reported a child to Child Protective Services because you've seen a mark on their arm or something like that. And then the child becomes very angry because they're defending the adult in the home who may have actually hit them and made the mark, but they are defending the person that they have bonded with. Whether it's a healthy bond or not, they will defend them. And we see that sometimes. Sometimes children from trauma avoid healthy age-appropriate peers. It is difficult for them to be around their own peers because they'll feel like they're very different. They'll feel like peers don't understand them. They'll feel like if they tell peers what's happening in their life, that the peers may reject them. So it's very hard for them to socialize with their peers. Oftentimes what we see in children from trauma is that they will either make relationships with younger peers, and we'll think that is unnatural and healthy, but it's easier for them because younger children are not demanding for answers about why and what happened and things like that. They just accept the the child at face value, so it's an easier relationship for them. Or they will overfunction or kind of be the parent. And this is a child in school that oftentimes looks really good to a person in the school system because they are the helpers, they're always trying to help other students, and it is really a response to trauma that is overfunctioning. So we want to watch that as well. Sometimes we miss signs and symptoms in children when they manifest as good things. So the last one again is tantrums and rages, and sometimes we don't know what sets a child off. And there's a whole behavior model that is solely based on, let's look at the environment and let's look at what's happening prior to the tantrum and the rage. Because when children are triggered who come from trauma, they can go into a tantrum and a rage, and sometimes we have no idea what actually set them off until we actually examine the situation. There's also cognitive trauma symptoms, and these are some that are really a little harder, and sometimes we hear what children say, but sometimes we don't catch it enough. And some of these are inaccurate cognition. So children often blame themselves for the things that happen to them, and it really is not their fault. So for instance, sometimes children who are sexually abused blame themselves because I had a child say to me once, I wore a dress, and if I hadn't worn a dress, then he wouldn't have done that to me. And it's really trying to get the children to understand that it had nothing to do with the dress. And sometimes that's really hard, but they transfer that over to other parts of their lives and think that lots of things are their fault. They have irrational cognitions. So oftentimes, because a child lives in a traumatic situation where there's abuse or neglect, they cannot trust that their caregivers or the adults in their lives are going to be there for them. And they can't trust that they're going to help them. And so because they can't trust those primary caregivers, they then transfer that to the world, and no one is trustworthy. So I can't trust my friends and I can't trust my teachers. And again, we have to be able to recognize that and shift that belief system by our interactions with children. And sometimes it takes a little longer, but I often say the children that are most difficult are the ones that need us the most. Really hard for children who have a loss of faith. So for children in some of these homes and who've been exposed to some of this trauma, even if their family is religious and goes to church every Sunday, they sometimes lose faith in a God. They don't see him as helpful, and why would he do this if God loves everybody, which is what the learning is in church. Or they lose faith in the future. They don't see a future for themselves. So for instance, when I did some work in the urban district, I had a child whose brother died in a violent crime, and he just lost faith that he was ever going to make it to adulthood because most of his friends were getting shot or getting killed. And so he just decided, he gave up, and he said, I might as well just start doing whatever I want because I'm not going to get to be an adult. I'm never going to make it to 21. And so again, because he saw no future for himself, he began doing all these risky behaviors. And they really begin to have unhealthy relationships, either relationships with much younger children, or their relationships are violent or tumultuous because they don't have some of those basics. They can't trust, and they don't feel that they deserve anything. So think about a married couple where there's an infidelity. It is really difficult to get trust back. And trust is one of the primary core elements of relationship. And if I don't trust anybody, it's really hard for me to have a relationship at all. Sometimes, of course, they may duplicate the relationship they have with their primary caretaker. So if it's abusive, they may get into abusive relationships. Some of our interpersonal trauma, and that's our relationships with other peers. So I started to touch on that. Sometimes they'll withdraw from peers. Again, they don't want to make the explanations. They don't want to have to share their shameful experiences. Children quickly learn if they come from a traumatic situation or an abusive home or a neglectful home, that not all children that they go to school with live like that. If they only have one parent in the home, or if a parent has gone to prison, they quickly learn in a school system that not everybody has that same experience. And so they are embarrassed and they don't want to share with their peers and they don't want to get questions. Why don't you have new clothes, or why don't you have, an outfit for the dance? And they don't want to make those explanations. So they just withdraw. It's easier. They stop enjoying their activities. And this is a real easy one. If I go out into the playground, and of course we're not going to see that right now, but if I see a child who's constantly sitting by themselves, what is going on with that child? They could be a child who has experienced trauma, or they could just be sad, or there could be something momentarily happening. But those are the children we have to look out for. Again, they have difficulty establishing relationships, and oftentimes they will affiliate with a high-risk peer. So they might start running with kids who are getting in trouble, or kids who are experimenting with drugs, or gangs, because again, when they're in those crowds, those children, because they may have issues of their own, don't ask a lot of questions, don't expect much. So there's not a lot of demand on them to be present in a relationship. And so it's easy for them. Trauma also changes their perception in the world. And this is the part that I tell people is, for me, the most critical, because it really changes how they see themselves and how they see themselves in the world and how they see the world. So children who are traumatized and separate from a trauma place really don't see a place where they belong. They don't feel they fit in, they don't feel they're going to belong anywhere, they don't feel there's any hope. And we're going to hear from some of those survivors, so you can actually see what's going on in their head. They really lose hope, and they lose hope in lots of things, like the urban boy whose brother was killed, lost hope that there was any future for them. They lose hope that they can become something. They lose hope that anybody can help them. They view themselves as good or bad, and mostly they view themselves as bad. There is something wrong with them. They did something bad, and this is why these things happen to them. They don't see opportunity. So where sometimes adults are saying, there's so much in front of you, there's so much you could do, that you have so much potential. Children do not see that, because all they see is that they are bad, and that the world is not a safe place, and that it is not helpful, and they don't belong in it. And again, that can be very scary. So, think of the kindergarten child who comes to school, and all of a sudden, coming from a home where it's really difficult and it may be abusive, and I don't have enough food to eat or clothes to wear, and they suddenly come to school and they're surrounded by loud, happy children. Sometimes it's overwhelming for them. And it is scary, and they do cry, or they do have tantrums, or they do act out, or they try to run away. So they're trying to avoid the situation. And for children of trauma, the world is unpredictable. So they can't count on things, because again, when you can't count on your primary caregivers, you can't count on the world. And they just transfer the cognition. I can't count on mommy and daddy, so I can't count on anybody else in the world. And right now, unfortunately, COVID-19 is reinforcing the scary and the unpredictable status of the world for these children. So in addition to their trauma, on top of that, we have the COVID, and that can be very negative. And the last one is that they really don't see that anybody is there to help. And so they don't believe that there is help. They don't believe that you can help them. They don't believe that they are helped, that they are able to be helped. And that's the really hard part. So when we look, this is a trauma survivor's account. And I read this because I think we really need to understand this. So this is a little girl, again, having gone through therapy and survived. I remember crying in the night. I found it difficult to hear Mrs. Patterson when she spoke in the classroom. I felt as if she were speaking from beneath tumbling waters, or from the end of a long tunnel. She assumed I was daydreaming. I stopped imagining that I might one day be a teacher. No longer did my imagination dance me through the leaves. The sound of ringing church bells irritated me. Mostly, I felt ashamed and different. So we can see in this child's account that she has lost hope, that she is being misunderstood, that she's lost any hope for opportunity in the future, that she can't even imagine, excuse me, she can't even imagine herself there. This is what happens with children of trauma. So the 3 E's of trauma is the event, the experience of the event, and the effects of the event. And not everyone experiences a traumatic event the same way. So for instance, there was a convenience store robbery, and there were 2 gentlemen in the store when the convenience store was robbed at gunpoint. And the perpetrator came in, held up the cash register, hit the cashier over the head with a gun, and then ran with the money. The police came and interviewed the 2 people. So the one gentleman was on his phone, FaceTiming his friends. You wouldn't believe what happened. You know, I was in the convenience store and it just got robbed and the police are here and I'm giving my statement and it was so wild and the guy had a gun, and he's relaying these events to friends like this is a, you know, event to be talked about. The other person who was in the store was crouched in the corner in a fetal position, unable to speak or give the police an account of what had happened. And again, 2 people, same event, different experience. And it really depends on our experience. It's why sometimes when there's a traumatic event like a natural disaster or a 9/11, there are people who are children who are very traumatized and children who have a lot of support and connection around them to be able to help them process the event and really work through their feelings, that they don't experience the ongoing trauma that maybe the children who don't have connection and don't have support experience. And so again, it is the event, it's the experience of the event, and it's how I interpret the event and give it meaning that determines whether it will be traumatic to me in my life. And again, like I said before, sometimes people do not make the connection between an event and the trauma it incurs. So when I was in the urban district, children would talk to me about how they hear gunshots through the night, and hearing gunshots and people getting shot is a normal part of their neighborhood. And they really didn't think that that was traumatic, but in fact, they didn't connect the 2. So we really need to approach things from a trauma-sensitive approach. And what is that? So a trauma-sensitive approach is realizing, you know, how much trauma impacts, you know, and understanding the potential paths for recovery. It's recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in students, families, staff, and others involved in the system. So, you know, sometimes I hear people saying, you know, we can't get families to come into school. Well, sometimes those families won't come into school because maybe when they were young, they had a very traumatic school experience. And so school is scary to them. It is not a place that's comfortable. It brings back bad memories. And so they don't want to come into school, even for their own children. And so we need to recognize that sometimes we need to do some things a little differently and approach people a little differently. And then responding with all of this knowledge that we have about trauma and putting it into our policies and our procedures and our practices. And we're going to talk about traditional approaches to children and traumatic approaches, trauma-sensitive approaches, and really seeking to not re-traumatize the children that are in front of us. So again, these are the 4 R's of trauma-sensitive approaches. So the status of our students. We really need to begin to have a conversation. This is not something where we're going to be able to come back to school and go straight to academics, whether we're returning to school remotely or in person or a hybrid of those things. We really need to assess the mental health of our children, and a lot of the schools are doing a screening so that they can see, you know, where children are functioning at. Are they anxious? Are they depressed? You know, is something else going on? You know, the lockdown situation. You know, who were they locked down with? Were they locked down with their biological family? Were they locked down with maybe a relative? Was their family member not able to be there? Some of my frontline workers that I'm working with do not stay in their houses during the weeks that they're working, and really try to keep some distance from their children because they don't want to spread the virus, or they don't want to scare them. So we really have to find out what the lockdown situation was. You know, there are some students, which was very frustrating for many of my teenagers, whose, you know, they had friends who were out and about shortly after the quarantine and interacting with their other friends, and then their families were maintaining a very conservative approach to the quarantine, and so they felt very left out. There are students who I have now whose parents are still not letting them be out in public with their friends, and so again, some parents are really easing up on the restrictions while others aren't, so there's a discrepancy there. Um, you know, oftentimes, you know, when we're parents and kids are trying to do the keep up with the Joneses, you know, somebody gets a pair of uh, Jordan sneakers, and then everybody needs to have a pair of Jordan sneakers. This has taken that perspective to sort of a whole new level. You know, I can go out with my friends or hang out, but I can't go out with those friends and hang out, and I'm feeling left out. So again, whole new level of, you know, what we're doing. The health of family and friends, you know, are our children experiencing that? Some of my children who come from more urban neighborhoods have had a lot more experience of friends and families who are being affected by the virus, or who have passed away during this time. And it's been very difficult for them, you know. And again, if I have a family member who's at risk, you know, children, and again, I understand parents sometimes are saying to children, well, you can't go out because if you come home and you give it to grandma, grandma will die. And that's really not a healthy thing to say to a child. We really need to explain that in very different terms, because what children hear is that they're responsible. And then if something does happen, they feel like it's their fault. So we need to watch that. We need to find out from our students what their coping strategies are. What have they done during this period of time to help them either deal with the isolation, or deal with not being connected, or deal with being bored? I can't tell you how many teens I have said that, you know, like I said, my one teen said, rinse and repeat every day. You know, so what are they doing different? What are their coping strategies? If a teenager is home and they're in their room all the time, not a great coping strategy. You know, and in the past, I certainly, you know, explained to parents that teens need alone time. They need to have that time, that private time, to be in their room and do things. We're looking at that very differently right now, in that if a teen is in their room all the time, it is not a good idea. Again, we're now looking at people needing to get out of their houses. Being cooped up and shut up in houses is not some of a very healthy routine. What was their routine and schedule? So again, you know, did their parents make them, you know, get out of bed? Did they make them have a routine? Did they have to get up in the morning? Did they have to go to bed at a certain time? We're having, you know, some difficulty now because the teenagers have been awake all night these days, and they've been sleeping through the day. And so now schools who are going back remotely saying you need to show up at 7:30 in the morning, and you need to be on camera so that I can see you. Teens have not been awake in the morning for weeks or maybe months. And so again, you know, we have to find out from them, what was their schedule? What is their routine? Because they may be having difficulty getting up. I know that towards the end of last year, my teens told me often that they would log into the Google Meets, or they would log into Zoom, and they would turn their cameras off and go back to bed. So again, we need to make sure that our students are present, either remotely or hybridly. You know, grief, persons or events. A lot of children are experiencing what we term anticipatory grief. They are now anticipating that they're going to lose things. So again, children going into their senior year are anticipating that they're going to lose their prom, and they're going to lose their graduation ceremony like it should be held, or they're going to lose plays, or they're, you know, going to lose other events that they've looked forward to. I know that my students who are 8th graders going into high school, who were very excited about going to high school, are very disappointed because it's not feeling like they're in 9th grade. It's feeling like just a continuation of 8th grade. And then academically, we need to recognize that there is going to be some decline in our students' functioning. You know, they may not recoup what they learned last year, or they may be behind. And we need to allow them time to catch up and really be connecting with them about what they need. So there's a couple of things that make our students vulnerable. And some of these are internal factors and some of these are external factors. So again, the coping style, you know, how are you coping with this situation? And again, if a child can tell you they don't know, that tells me that there's not a whole lot of coping mechanisms in place. Typically, before COVID even started, a lot of the children that came to me in private practice, after I assessed them, the number one thing that I would found in most children is that they don't have any coping skills. And I would have to tell that to a parent, or I would have to tell the parent that they've adopted their negative coping skills. So for instance, I had one child who, a young teen, her parents were always fighting and threatening divorce back and forth, and she would become very anxious because she was afraid her parents would get divorced. Now, her father was obsessive compulsive, and he did a lot of things like hand washing and checking locks on the doors multiple times and closing doors and counting things. And so she began to adopt his behaviors. And they took her to the doctor, and the doctor said, yes, you know, she certainly has OCD symptoms, obsessive compulsive disorder symptoms, and we need to put her on medication. And the parents did not want to put her on medication because they felt she was too young. So the doctor suggested therapy, and they brought the child to me. And I spent several sessions with the child, and I came back to the parent and I said, your child doesn't have OCD. She doesn't have any coping skills. And so because she doesn't have any, she's copying that. I said, and she gets anxious when you all fight and threaten divorce because she's afraid you're going to get divorced. And so I started working with the child, and we developed some coping skills of her own. And the behaviors of checking locks on the doors and washing her hands and counting things like her father disappeared. And, you know, the father thought that I was a miracle worker. I said, I'm not a miracle worker. I said, your daughter just didn't have any coping skills, so she did what you did. And so once she learned her own, then she was able to deal with it. And once the parents got into therapy and stopped fighting and learned how to communicate better, there wasn't this threat of divorce being thrown around. So again, what coping skills do children have? And they may not have any, and we may have to give them some. If there's a pre-existing mental health condition, my children who suffer from anxiety, their anxiety has risen exponentially during this time. And some of them have become very comfortable being in their home, and now they don't want to leave. They don't want to go out to dinner with their parents. They don't want to go out to the park. They don't want to do anything because now they've kind of insulated themselves in their house and they feel safe in their room and they don't want to go anywhere else. So again, it can go both ways where they don't want to come out or they come out and they're afraid of everything. Emotional regulation. If I'm in a household where my adults are not emotionally regulated, then I have trouble doing that. And this is something where I tell educators in the classroom, we really need to model calmness. And you're going to see that's going to come up several times. We need to model the things that we want our children to learn. So if I'm an adult and I'm frustrated and I'm angry because children aren't doing their homework or they're not paying attention, I have to do something different than yell and scream. That is not helpful. What that does is model to children that when I'm frustrated or angry, I yell and scream. And so then we're surprised when children do that. But again, if we want to really teach emotional regulation, we have to teach them skills and we have to model those. If a child has a history of trauma, this time period can additionally, you know, put more trauma on top of that or put more problems on top of that. So again, it's important if we know if there's a history of trauma, and we may not know that because children may keep that very secret, or we may have access to some of that history. If a child has self-efficacy, if there are things that the child feels that they do well, if they have some competence or confidence in the skills and abilities they have, you know, sometimes, you know, children, because of their circumstances, don't have any of that. Certainly feeling powerlessness, and that's something that all of us are experiencing because we don't have power over what's going on in a lot of places. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you in the schools, because I listened to teachers and I talked to them, did not have a whole lot of say in terms of whether they were going to teach remote or teach hybrid or teach in person. It was being decided for them. And so we saw some kickbacks. We saw some kickbacks to that, unions taking up a cause, or people getting letters from their doctors because they were too anxious to go back to school because they felt like they had no power over the situation. So again, children are feeling the same feelings. And then their self-esteem. Do they have any self-esteem? Is that high or low? And that's really easy to, ascertain from a student when we ask them, what are some good things that you do, or what do you do well, or what are, your strengths? Children, if they have low self-esteem, can tell you all the things that they can't do, but they very rarely can tell you some of the things they can do. And we need to lift that part of children up. External factors, again, family they're living with, parenting exposure. Were their parents anxious? Were their parents yelling all the time? Are their parents frustrated? Are their parents, stressed? These kinds of things. If they already came from a dysfunctional family, or if over the course of COVID, more dysfunction occurred, what their economic status was. We know that, even the free lunch programs that we've been still trying to keep kids, give kids support. Again, we're seeing people lose their homes, and we're seeing people lose their vehicles, and people not being able to pay their rent. What was their social support? Did they have any social support? And that's, we're going to talk about some questions that we can ask kids to sort of find out these things. What were their adult models? And again, children look at adults as models. My favorite example is, I tell parents, if you smoke and you tell your children not to smoke, your children will probably smoke, because they see you smoking. And so again, children model what they see, not what we say. And I've had parents who say, oh, well, I go outside and, I do it at night and I don't do it in front of my kids. But children know you're smoking. And so when time comes for them to either, be offered a cigarette or something like that, in their minds, they think, oh, it's not so bad because my dad or my mom smokes, So again, we act as models. And what's the coping strategies of the adults? That's really important. What are our coping strategies? What do we use? So opening the conversation. We really need to, when we reconvene with students, we really need to have some conversations with them. And we can't just start with diving into academics, because that's not where they're going to be at the moment. They're not going to be ready for that. They're not going to be prepared for that. And again, we don't know the status of our students. Even if you're doing a screening in your school, most of the screenings are not happening until about the second week of school, when kids are in, and we've really seen, eyeballed them for a couple weeks, and then we're asking them to do it. But we need to open the conversation about how COVID is affecting them. What do they think of the COVID crisis? I have some students who say to me, oh, I'm over it already, and that's sort of a shut the door, I don't want to talk about it response. And I had a teacher after one of my presentations ask me, what do I say to a student who says that? And she said, what I try to do is give them the positives. And I said, you can do that, but the reality is, what are you over? That's what I would ask the student. I'm over it already. Okay, what are you over? Really, again, be the detective. Bring that out in the child. What are you over? Or, I'm feeling stuck. What are you feeling stuck about? Or, I'm tired of everybody talking about COVID. I'm tired of wearing a mask. So again, how did the COVID affect the students? Did they have anybody who passed from the virus? Did they have anybody who got the virus and didn't pass? Are their parents being conservative and, holding the letter of the law for the quarantine? Or are they allowing them to have some, connection with friends and some sleepovers and things like that? And again, in my experience, everybody is doing this differently. So I have one parent who allows her child to go to a sleepover at a friend's house. She gets to stay there for 3 days. And when she comes home, she has to stay home for 14 days. And then she can have another sleepover. And then they kind of quarantine her for 14 days. So I have parents doing that. I have parents saying no sleepovers. I have parents saying you can have your friends over and you have to sit in the backyard 6 feet away from each other. I have parents who are saying, oh, I think the kids are good now. Their friends haven't been exposed. Nobody's gotten it in our neighborhood, so we just let them out to play. So again, what is the student's experience? School start. What does that look like? How did they feel about, how the school year ended last year? How did they feel about, starting this year? As much as the teachers and the educators have sort of been in uncertainty about, are we going in person? Are we going hybrid? Are we going remote? The children have been in the same boat. They've been going back and forth about whether they are going back to school and whether they need to prepare. Even school shopping. I sat in a meeting the other day where two people expressed that they took their kids school shopping for school clothes. And I thought, well, that certainly is keeping in a normal routine. And I have other parents who are saying, why bother going school shopping? What am I going to buy new clothes for? They're just going to be on Zoom. And again, so very different approaches of how we're thinking about the school year starting. Absence from school. What are some of the things you enjoyed while you were being away from school? How did it feel to be away from school? What were some of the things that were scary when you were away? What are some of the things that still feel scary? What is the best thing you did while you were away? What is a good thing you did while you were away? What is something good that happened or that came of it? So, one of my students, when I do some of this when I'm just in private practice, because kids really begin to lose perspective being quarantined for a long period of time, and again, so what changed? What was a good thing that changed? What was, a difficult thing that changed? And I had one student say to me, well, I get to see my dad more because he's home more. He's working from home and he eats dinner with us now. And it's nice because we never ate dinner with him. The father was typically a commuter. He commuted to New York. He worked all day. He commuted home. So he left very early in the morning and he got home at 8 or 9 o'clock at night when the child was already going to bed. So again, didn't see their father except for weekends. Now they're seeing them all the time. So that's a good thing. Again, we have parents who are home all the time now who are micromanaging children. Did you clean your room? And did you do your chores? And, did you do this? Did you do that? And that's very difficult for kids. Again, what was the hardest thing during your time away from school? Ask about the family home situation. How was it being around your family all this time? And who was in your household? Some families have taken in elderly relatives for multiple reasons. Either they lost their homes or their apartments because of financial reasons, or they needed to be cared for and a family couldn't be moving back and forth, so they took them into the home. And again, that changes the dynamic of having to be a caretaker in a home. And their feelings about returning. How do you feel about returning to school? If and when we get to be in person, we're going to have that conversation again. Do you feel safe coming back to school? And how can we make you feel safer? And what would be specific things we can do to make sure that our classroom is safe for everybody? What are some of the pros and cons about returning? What are some of the pros and cons about remote? And we're going to also have to ask students what their status was in terms of learning, because at the end of last year, I have some students who said, yeah, I finished algebra, but I really don't get algebra, and I'm going to be in algebra 2, or I'm going to be in geometry, and I don't know how I'm going to do that class. So we need to figure out what their level is. Opening the conversation in person, again, we're going to have to talk about students' feelings of safety, how we establish safety, what do they need, some of the pros and cons. And this I just ask you to keep sort of in the back of your head, because I know we're opening remotely at this moment, but I do know that there is still the push to get children back into school in person for a number of reasons. And when we do finally make that transition, we are going to have another conversation. It won't just be, we were working on algebraic equations and now we're in person and we're going to keep working on algebraic equations. No, we're going to have a little conversation first. So just keep this in the back of your mind. And again, we have to determine if it's stress, trauma, or mental health. So we've already defined trauma. Stress, I think we all know what that is, but it is a state where our mental and emotional strain results from adverse or very demanding circumstances. And certainly COVID constitutes an adverse circumstance. It can be episodic, where, when we take on too many tasks and we become overwhelmed, by the demands, and we're unable to meet those demands. And some of that stress, an episodic stress would be the person who takes in their elderly relative into their home, because now they've taken on that caretaking responsibility, and that can be overwhelming. Or it can be chronic stress that is prolonged over time. And certainly, COVID is providing us with some issues that can produce chronic stress, economic hardships, employment hardships. And chronic stress is degenerative. It does take a toll on our bodies, our health, and our minds. So we need to determine which it is. And so what does stress in young children look like? So in young children, it looks like, they have difficulty concentrating. They have difficulty paying attention. And I'm doing therapy via telehealth, and I know that the younger children, it's really hard to keep them engaged when you are on a camera or on video. So I certainly understand and empathize with teachers who are doing elementary school level to keep the kids engaged. That is a challenge, and I'm sure with the extended hours, it'll be more of a challenge. And we're going to see some behavioral changes. It looks like fears. I had a young girl whose mother suffered from anxiety, and in her mind, she developed this belief that COVID was a monster, and the monster was outside her door. So she couldn't go out of her house because the COVID monster was going to be outside. And so we really had to kind of explore that and do some, age-appropriate explanation about the COVID virus, and really do some desensitization with her about going outside and there being no monster out there. And her mother had no idea that she had developed this whole meaning in her head about the COVID. So they do have fears. Development of nervous habits, nail biting, hair pulling, scratching, those kinds of things we have to watch for. And again, if you're on remote with a child, because they're in their home, you're going to see some more of these behaviors because they're in their natural environment. And that is one of the advantages of doing remote learning, is that we get to see kids in their natural environment, and they may exhibit behaviors that we don't necessarily see in class. Do they withdraw? Do kids sit on your Zoom or your Google Meets and not engage? And again, some might not engage because they don't want people to see that they don't have any furnishings in their house, or they live in a poor house, or they're conscious about what they have on or what they're wearing. And again, the younger children love to use the chat room. So when I'm doing telehealth and I have a young child, I do allow them to use the chat room because they find it fun. So again, it's a way that I can engage them and keep them going. School refusal. We have some kids that have been MIA. We don't know where they are. They're refusing to connect with schools. And we have to do some really creative ways to connect with them and figure out what is the school refusal. When we go back in person, I think we're going to see an increase in school refusal, because our children who suffer from anxiety, who already had trouble going to school, and because they've been home and comfortable with the remote learning, are not going to want to go back. So that's going to be something we're going to have to be aware of in the back of our mind for down the road. Problematic behaviors. The young kids, when they want to, they shut off the video, or they walk away from the computer, or they do things like that, and we're going to have, that's sometimes stress. Somatic complaints, we see that in school. You're going to see it remotely as well. The child that's always going down to the nurse. And I always tell educators, there's a reason why they keep going to the nurse. So, and changes in sleep and appetite, we may or may not see that. Stress in adolescence. So our adolescents look a little different. They will also have some somatic complaints. Somatic complaints for adolescents are usually stomach aches and headaches. Those are the two. We may see them withdraw or shut down. Withdrawing, again, not coming onto the classroom, not engaging, not doing homework, and that is some of the challenges of this remote learning. And we need to do some creative strategies to get children involved. And we're going to talk about some of those a little bit later. We may see adolescents who are irritable or angry. You know, I hear my adolescents saying to me all the time, you know, I'm over this already. You know, I'm over COVID. I'm over this not being in school. I'm over not being able to see my friends. You know, they're angry at other people. You know, why aren't these people wearing a mask? And why aren't these people doing what they're supposed to? And, you know, sometimes their anger is misplaced. You know, we need to rein that in a little bit. We're going to see increased emotional responses. Again, you know, some of the adolescents are already feeling sad about some of the events that they participate in that aren't going to happen. Academic and performance, we need to expect that our adolescents are going to have a decline in some of their information, you know, recouping some of the information they did have, or because they had difficulty in ending the school year in a certain subject. I know that this last weekend, some of my adolescents took their SATs and they took them in person at one of the local schools, and they were really upset because they said we were not 6 feet apart, and there were a lot of students in the school, and it was hard for me to concentrate on the SAT, but I wore my mask the whole time and I did what I needed to do. But again, you know, we might see some drop in academic performance. Hopelessness, I think sometimes that we wax and wane in hopelessness for everyone right now. You know, when is this going to end? Are they going to get a vaccine? You know, sleep and appetite changes. Like I said, I already talked to you about teenagers who are staying up all night and sleeping all day. And again, I can tell parents, you know, that's not a good thing. We need to get them up. We need to get them moving. You know, some kids are eating a whole lot. Some kids aren't eating much at all. I've had, you know, children on both sides. They do have difficulty concentrating. You know, I have a student who's an avid reader, and she said, I noticed I stopped reading. I love to read, and I read all kinds of things. I mean, she won an award in her school for um, reading the most books during a certain period of time one year. And so she really is an avid reader. And she said, I haven't read a book. I haven't felt like it. I haven't wanted to do that. You know, she says, because I read and then I don't know what I read and I have to read it over. So that's the concentration piece. And then again, self-medicating. I am hearing my adolescents tell me that there is an increased use in vaping and marijuana among adolescents. I'm always kind of amazed at how they're getting it when they're not going out of their house, but they do say that it calms them down. It makes them feel better. It takes the edge off. So again, they may be self-medicated, and they may self-medicate with marijuana or vaping, or they may be self-medicating with food or alcohol. So again, we need to determine if it's mental health. So the 4 things that are really standing out during this time of COVID are depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and substance abuse. And we're just going to go through how some of that might look. So in children 6 to 12, these are some of the signs of depression. You know, frequent sadness, hopelessness, they don't enjoy things. I'm constantly saying I'm bored. They may isolate, or they may feel like they're isolated because they can't see their friends. They don't feel good about themselves. They're irritable. They have trouble concentrating. They're very sensitive to anything adults say. So if you say anything that in any way feels to them like they failed or they were rejected, they will have an emotional response to that. You know, lots of complaints of, you know, aches, body aches, headaches, stomach aches, things like that. I don't feel good. Some children are having some suicide ideation. We have still hospitalized several children during this period. Again, you know, anxiety, difficult concentrating. And you'll see how some of the symptoms mirror things that happen to us when we're stressed. They mirror when we are traumatized. So again, the way to sort of be the detective and figure out which it is really to have conversations with kids. You know, anxiety, irritable, outbursts, constant worry, you know, the tensing and fidgety. You know, children with anxiety will use the bathroom a lot when they're in school, but when they're on remote, they will also use the bathroom a lot. When I have children in therapy and they're young, I can always count on that at least once or twice in my 1 hour session, they're going to have to go to the bathroom 1 or 2 times. And again, it's just some of the anxiety. So you might see that remotely because they might run away and back from the camera saying, I have to go to the bathroom. They might be crying or clingy. Parents are telling me that their young children are very clingy and don't want to leave them, and don't like when they leave the house, even to go like grocery shopping or things like that. And this is how PTSD looks in children, ages 6 through 12. And you can see a lot of the same symptoms, but there are some differences. With PTSD, they might be preoccupied with whatever event. So young children are very preoccupied at the moment with, if they've had a death of someone from COVID, they're very preoccupied with COVID and that person dying. So they may not want to come to school. They might be argumentative with you. Again, big one is fixating on the event and questioning sort of beliefs like, why did grandma die, and why did COVID come to our house and it didn't come to anybody else's house, and things like that. And sometimes they're unable to process that, and we'll talk about it. We really need to have conversations with kids and be honest with them. Depression in adolescence, a little bit of different symptoms than younger children. Again, the sad mood, the lack of enjoyment. Adolescents really lose energy, and then they feel worthless. Lots of conversations I'm having with my adolescents about death right now. And, the whole argument of, well, if, I might get COVID anyway, does it matter? I've heard that conversation. I've had that conversation, and we really need to talk to them about, how do we keep ourselves safe? Difficulty making decisions. And again, this is something you as a educator can pose to your adolescents. Give them opportunities to have to make decisions. See if that's a place where they are functioning. They become agitated, complaining of being tired, spending lots of time in their room. I talked about that. That's a normal balance we struggle with when we are not in a COVID situation. Right now, it's even worse. Children are spending lots of time in their room, and we need to get them out. Avoiding discussing the events. Children don't want to talk about COVID anymore sometimes, and we really need to figure out where they are in terms of how they feel about it. Academic importance, performance I've talked about. We're going to see it in their writings and drawings. So as you go back to school and you're asking children to do writings, and maybe they're having art classes and use drawings, we need to pay attention to what they're producing for us. And then use of substances. Anxiety in adolescence, their somatic complaints become a little bit more. So you can see the long list there. With younger children, it's really just, I don't feel well, or I have a headache. With older adolescents, they're able to verbalize more what their symptoms are. They do have trouble concentrating, having memory, again, the indecisiveness, some of these other things, feeling on the edge, constantly being sort of hypervigilant. They may become quiet. Their academic performance may change. They do become more impatient. So again, they might avoid talking about some of these things. And maybe if children don't want to talk about it, maybe we can have them write about it. A lot of my teenagers are doing a lot more journaling these days, and they're finding it very beneficial and therapeutic, and I'm encouraging it because that's at least a way for them to talk about how they feel. PTSD in adolescence, again, re-experiencing the events. They might talk about nightmares and flashbacks. They might have some intrusive memories. They will have a negative outlook, which again may be exacerbated by a COVID experience. Certainly depression. So these are some of the signs of PTSD in adolescence. And again, I'm not asking you to be diagnosticians. I'm asking you just to be aware. And so I give you the information so we have an awareness. Substance abuse in adolescence is a little difficult right now from the school perspective, but certainly if you're a parent or you're talking to parents, and we're going to talk about being connected with adults in children's lives, are they more secretive? Is there a decline in their academics? So in addition to staying in their rooms, I've heard adolescents talking about, tapping into liquor cabinets in either their house or their friend's house, or having older kids buy them alcohol. Are they avoiding or withdrawing? Are they changing friends? Is there some antisocial behaviors? So I have had some students who have had some scrapes with the law, with, having paraphernalia in their cars or being caught with substances in their cars. So again, we may or may not know that. And again, substance abuse in adolescence sometimes causes aggressive behavior and certainly self-injurious behavior and suicidal thoughts. And this is something, even remotely, we have to pay attention to, because whereas when kids come into school, they actively try to hide things like cutting and self-injury, when they are remote and at home and on cameras, they may not be as vigilant about covering wrists and wearing big sweatshirts and things like that. So the road back. So what does it look like? So we're going to foster safety. We're going to foster equity so that we can try to make things as equitable as possible. We're going to build community, which includes being trustworthy and transparent for people around us. We're going to collaborate, which means all the stakeholders at the table, the parents, the children, the families, anybody in the community that we work with. We're going to support student mental health. Like I said, lots of schools are doing screenings. Empowering, and that is giving voice and choice to our students and our families and people in the system, the staff included. Cultural, historical considerations, that is a really critical thing right now, so that kids have exemplars that we're providing for them that they can look up to. Responding to grief. There's a lot of grief for multiple things. Grief for people who they've lost, relatives or families. There's grief for events and rituals that they've lost. There's anticipatory grief, which is anticipating that I'm going to lose these things. We need to establish routines, even if on your remote, you're establishing, what your expectations are. This is what I expect, and this is our routine. Connecting kids with each other and connecting with our kids. Self-regulation and a vision for the future. Vision for the future is going to be really important, and I have a suggestion for that. So we're going to look at each of these individually, and I think I'm okay on time. So fostering safety. We need to make sure that kids feel safe physically, psychologically, and emotionally. We do that by building relationships, foundation of cultural competence, justice, and equity. Again, providing exemplars that match our racial cultural makeup, providing information. Again, providing accurate information. I tell people, access the CDC. They have scripts for how to describe and answer questions for children of all ages, from preschool to elementary to adolescent. Creating culture of joy. We really need to, and that's not to be happy, happy, joy, joy. We're not supposed to be the entertainers, but really creating a culture of, these are things that we're hopeful. These are things that we're happy about. Establishing routines, really, really critical, and we've been saying that since the beginning. Acknowledge the fears and concerns that children have, and empower self-care. So we need to be doing self-care so they can do self-care. Building community, creating belonging, emphasizing what our purpose is, what our goals are, giving them service opportunities. So I have one group of adolescents who is learning to knit, and they've all gone on YouTube. They've all learned to knit, and they're making scarves for the homeless for the winter. Again, that's goes into the next one, providing service opportunities. Instead of thinking how bad these things are for me, what can I do for somebody else? Providing cooperative activities. Children know how to do Google Meets, and they know how to do Zoom, and they know how to do getting together virtually. So we need to challenge them with activities that foster some of that cooperative learning. Also providing opportunities for them to be independent and for them to make some decisions. Opportunities for them to influence. One of the big things was, how are the proms going to look? How is graduation going to look? And they sent a survey out to the kids to get their input. That's really important. And being aware of the mental health supports and resources that you have both in your community and in your school. Empowering all the stakeholders. And this is with joint decisions and providing different modes of learning. Not all kids are good virtual learners. They need experience, or they need visuals. We need to be able to do that. Skill development, helping children to build their skills. What are you really good at? Let's see that, let's build on that, and then let's lift up those skills that children don't necessarily have. Identifying their strengths, and building upon those strengths so that we can lift up some of those areas that they're weak in. Letting them be part of the decision-making process. Do you want to do this project in 2s or 4s? Do you want to have a test Tuesday or Friday? Really simple things, but really critical when you include children in that decision-making. Setting goals. I encourage people, if you're, especially with the younger kids, if you're meeting with them for a period of time, start with the meeting in the morning. What's your goal for the day? Maybe their goal for the day is they're going to be able to sit for, the first class the whole time, or maybe it is they're going to try to do half of their problems, or, a simple goal. And then at the end of the day, we wrap up with, how'd you do on your goal today? Not did you meet it, how did you do on it? Because we don't want them to be thinking about failure. Providing cultural sensitive activities, and that is, letting kids bring in their culture and ethnic important things into the classroom. So show and tell. Show and tell is a great thing to do for remote, and children can maybe show or talk about a special meal that is their family does, or a cultural ritual that maybe they do. And again, it helps them to connect with us. Responding to grief. And again, grief is a very individual thing, but there is multiple areas of grief that we are addressing these days. Certainly COVID, if somebody's had the virus, if somebody has died from the virus, if there's been a friend or family, that's one thing. Responding to grief, friends and family. Some kids are not living with their biological family because somebody had to leave to go take care of somebody else, or they're staying with friends. So again, that's a area of loss for them. Their feelings around it. We're going to see all the feelings: anger, sadness. We're going to see them, bargaining. We're going to see all of those stages of grief, and they're not linear. They are really dynamic, and they happen here and there. What are their coping strategies? How are they dealing with this? What are they doing? What are their rituals? What rituals have been disrupted? And how can we creatively develop some of those rituals? How do we honor the person that's gone, or how do we honor that loss? And feelings of guilt. Some children feel responsible if a friend or relative is sick or is dying. And checking in. How are they doing? Checking in with the families. Is there anything I need to know? Did you lose anybody? Are you guys affected? Do you need help? And creating a vision. This is really important because at the moment there's a lot of hopelessness and fear that this is not going to end, that we're not going to get past this, that we're not going to get back to some kind of normal. And it's really creating a vision. So if that looks like, what do you want to do in the next 5 years, or creating a vision board. And this is something that I do in therapy. I also encourage people to do it, and kids can do it right from their house. So they can get just a piece of poster board and use magazines or draw pictures about what they want in the future, what they want to see happen. One of my kids is all about, I want to go back to Disney. We can't go to Disney right now. So her vision board included Mickey Mouse and going to Disney. So what does my vision look like? And this is something that I encourage adults as well as children to do. So when you have children create their vision, create one for yourself, model that for them. This is interventions, for the young kids, reinforce safety, and even at home, when they're talking about, like, I miss my friends, or I can't go to the store, or this, reinforce, your mom is being safe, or your dad is being safe, or they're taking care of you so nothing happens to you. Give them concrete examples. When children say to me, well, I was at the beach and nobody was wearing a mask and my mom made me wear a mask. Yes, you're right. Some people don't wear masks, but your mom is doing the best thing that she knows how to do to keep you as safe. Listening. And this is a hard one because as adults, we constantly want to solve problems for our children and we constantly want to fix. And sometimes they just need us to listen to how they're feeling. I had a child talk to me all about that. They hear the conversations of their parents about how financially strapped they are, and they can't afford to do certain things, and that so the child is afraid to ask for notebooks for school because she's afraid that her parents can't afford it. So again, her parents did not know that she was hearing all the conversations they were having, but because I was able to listen to her and she was able to talk about some of these feelings, I was able to convey that to the parents. And reassuring that all their feelings are okay. Validate that it's okay to be scared. It's okay to be nervous. It's okay to feel depressed sometimes. Like, we are sad about the things that we lost, and there's a whole piece about disclosure. I do let kids know that sometimes I have days where when the sun isn't shining and it's raining, that I feel like, sometimes I can't get out and I feel sad. I model being calm. I don't model being hysterical or anxious. Even if I am, I try to really ground myself so that I don't pass that on. But again, I'm honest, because children do see through a facade. So again, I can say to them, I am nervous, but I'm trying to be calm and I'm trying to breathe and I'm really trying to stay in my body. Answering questions. Children have all kinds of questions, and some of them are very unique and some of them are very bizarre. But we need to answer them the best we can. And it's okay to say to a child, I don't know, but I can find out. And again, then I go to websites like the CDC and I find out answers for them. And again, the expectation that children are going to have academic difficulties. They may have not gotten the basis that they needed at the conclusion of last year's school year to start this year's school year. So we need to be, expect that. Again, maintain contact with the adults in their lives. Maybe you want to send a little, questionnaire to the family. What was happening over the summer? Did you lose anybody? Are you guys okay? Do you need any help? How can we help your child? A parent might say, well, we couldn't get out and get school supplies. So, there are lots of, banks and agencies that are creating backpacks for kids who don't have school supplies. We encourage healing tasks. And as much as I know that everybody's sort of tired of hearing about yoga and meditation, we are learning really rapidly that being outside in the sunshine and moving our bodies is critical to healing. And so again, if even remote learning, I was on a conference the other day and the speaker stood up and did a whole physical thing to show us a body movement that was really good for when we're feeling anxious. And again, in a small room, in a small space, he still did it. So we need to be able to do that too in our classrooms, periodically, especially if we're going to be remote for hours. It's hard to sit for a long period of time remotely. Be aware of our own personal reactions, and letting children guide the questions. They're going to be the ones who guide the conversation. And just being honest. When we don't know something, it's okay to say, I don't know. And it's okay to admit that maybe we're having a hard time too. Or maybe our children are having a hard time. That's also something where we can connect. Some of the interventions, have the children make a comic strip about, what they're feeling or how their life has been, directed art projects. I love first aid kits. So, if children tell me that they're feeling very anxious, I ask them, okay, so if we made a first aid kit for anxiety, what would it include? And sometimes kids will get a box and we'll decorate it all up and we'll put in a fidget toy, or we'll put in a squeegee toy, or we'll put in the packing material that they can pop, or we'll put in crayons and paper. Have them make first aid kits for whatever it is they're feeling. Again, body movement, yoga, exercise, just getting kids up and moving and in their body. Show and tell is a great one for remote, especially for little kids, because they love to show you their room and they love to show you their bed and they love to show you things that are hanging in the room and they love to show you that stuff that they made. So incorporate that right into the learning. Some SEL interventions, morning meetings, check in, check out, how are those doing? If you go on the CASEL website, CASEL, they have lots of interventions that they can give you for SEL type activities. Adolescent interventions, I'm going to kind of skim through because you guys are the elementary level. Other interventions, journaling. And for the young kids who can't write very well, I let them journal in pictures. Young kids may not do blogging, but certainly, again, the first aid kits. Young kids are using phone apps, including music. And creating a challenge or teaching a new skill to young kids. That's also, it's an intervention for adolescents, but also can be used with young children. And then staff self-care. This is a really important one, and we really need to identify our status. So I encourage you to go to both of these websites. The ACE is our adverse childhood experience, so it tells us what our adverse childhood experiences in terms of trauma. And so therefore, if we're aware of our own, we are better able to deal with children who may have trauma. The second one is the ProQual, which really assesses our level of burnout, secondary traumatic stress, and compassion fatigue. And I, as a provider, I do the ProQual probably every 6 months just to get a status of where I personally am functioning. And sometimes, you know, I know by key things. So, you know, I ask these questions. You know, do you find yourself more critical, cynical, or sarcastic? You know, is that something that you see coming out more? You know, have you lost your ability to experience something that makes you happy or is joyful? Do we drag ourselves out of bed to get on the computer to start working? Or do you drag yourself into the school if you have to go to the school? Have you become irritable and less patient? Do you feel like some of these barriers are insurmountable and you're not going to be able to teach the way you want to? These are all things to ask ourselves. You know, do you feel disillusioned about your job? I can't tell you how many educators tell me, I did not sign up to be a remote teacher, and they're having a really hard time with it. So again, you know, sometimes that causes us to be disillusioned. Do you no longer feel like you're achieving things with your students or with yourself? You know, lack of energy, productivity's down. Do you have a hard time laughing? I had a little girl, a story of a little girl whose mommy was going to happy hours every Friday. And the little child said to the mommy, you know, mommy, you go to happy hours, but you're not very happy. And the mommy realized that, hey, maybe, you know, I'm doing happy hours a little too much, and maybe I need to cut back on that. You know, that's that whole self-medicating with substances. Are you tired of your family or your coworkers or people around you asking if you're okay? You know, has your sleep and appetite changed? You know, are you having some somatic complaints? You know, and helpful suggestions. So this is, self-care is really important. We cannot take care of anybody else unless we take care of ourselves. So these are some suggestions for taking care of yourself. So one is having a meeting with yourself each day. And it could be in the morning where you just say, okay, today I'm going to try to do one thing on my list, or I'm going to get outside for 10 minutes, or today I'm going to, when I think about the COVID virus, I'm going to think about all the good things that are happening in my life. Establishing a gratitude practice. And the research actually shows that when we do a gratitude practice, that our autonomic nervous system, which is the one that goes into hyperdrive when we're feeling anxious or traumatized, actually settles down and becomes more quiet. You know, and a gratitude practice, people sometimes think that's big things in my life. A gratitude practice can be something really simple. I got out of bed today. I walk. I can see. I have food on the table. I have a roof over my head. You know, and then nightly, have a recap. I try to do recaps nightly. So before we go to bed, is a good time. I do gratitude practice twice a day. I do it in the morning and I do it when I lay down to go to bed. But a recap is when I think about one good thing that happened during the day or one good thing that I did during the day. If you can, meet with coworkers or supervisors if they're available. If your supervisor is somebody you don't necessarily connect with, you know, connect with somebody outside the school. There's lots of mentor programs. There's lots of programs where you can just call and talk. Just to connect and kind of feel through some things. And don't forget the work you do. The work you do is so important, even though it's so different right now, it is really, really important. And then of course, as a therapist and having been in therapy, I always encourage people to seek out a therapist if you need it. And don't try to change everything at once. Try to change one thing at a time. Here's some resources that, you know, you can look into. CASEAL, which is the one at the bottom, the two at the bottom they give actual activities that you can do with your children. The Whole Child Matters at the one on the top gives you some descriptions about how to talk to children also, in addition to the CDC. So I'm going to open it up now for questions and answers. We have about 15, 20 minutes. So, Kadi, what do you have for me?
Okay, so currently I've invited people to enter their questions and answers either in the Q&A or in the chat box. We do have some feedback that they think that these tips are good, especially for the adults, because in this current moment, they're really stressed.
Mhm.
So I'm waiting for people to enter in any questions that they may have. As a reminder, we've allotted some time toward the end. So no question is too big or small or too specific if it's relevant for your practice and your experience with children. Yes, we will send out a link to the PDF of our slides that PJ presented with us today and access to resources. And then we have more people who are thanking you for sharing this great information. But I have a question in the meantime, while people submit their questions for you. You mentioned the self-care component, and I know this has come up in previous Zoom webinars. Those, there's instances where they say too much of a good thing can turn into self-medicating. Can you elaborate more on that? I know we have now these Zoom happy hours and things like that. Are there other alternatives that you suggest where we don't turn a enjoyable activity into a self-medicating situation?
So sometimes for happy hour gatherings, because that's what we call them, I've had people who are actually changing those names. Instead of having happy hour, they're having a social hour. And then sometimes it is more directed. So they might take turns bringing a question into the group. So a question might be, name the first concert you went to and who you went with and how old you were. Or they might say, name, if you were on a deserted island and you could take 3 CDs, and that's me being old, 3 CDs, like what would they be? So a social hour where you're starting with sort of a thoughtful thing to get everybody talking. Also, I have people doing social hours where they're actually playing games. So playing games remotely, and sometimes that's a little challenging because we might not all have the game board or things like that, but it's been really fun watching people create that atmosphere. And you're right, too much of a good thing. We can do too many happy hours, or we can, be drinking too much. I mean, I've had different people say to me over time, I found that I'm having a glass of wine every night. And I realized that after listening to a self-care webinar. And so what I decided is I would limit my wine to 1 glass Saturday and Sunday, and I would not do wine Monday through Friday. So we have to watch how it's real easy to slide from doing something to self-medicating if we don't watch ourselves. And again, it's really creatively changing up what we do so that we don't get into that rut of doing the same thing over and over again. And we can do that for a number of reasons. I mean, after a traumatic event at a school, I did a debriefing about a month later, and one of the counselors said to me, I'm not really handling this well, and I know that because I got a big pack of Rocher balls, which are those chocolate hazelnut balls, and she said there were 45 balls and I ate them all. And she said, I knew that was not good. So again, we really have to monitor our behavior and then figure out what we can do differently. So sometimes some of those de-stressing activities, maybe, that's a question for a social hour. What do you do to de-stress? Some people might say, I take a bath, or, I had one person who said that for 10 minutes every day, she goes outside of her house and she sits and she closes her eyes and she tries to make a list of all the sounds that she hears. So the leaves rustling with the wind, or birds, or crickets, and she just really tunes into the outside area. And I thought that was a really neat thing to do for 10 minutes. You know, I have other people who say, like, I tell my children and everybody, I'm going in the bathroom and taking a bath for 30 minutes and do not disturb me for any reason. And then taking a bath and putting on headphones and relaxing for 30 minutes, just alone time. So, you know, again, we really have to sometimes be creative about how we're doing and really monitoring ourselves.
Absolutely. Thank you. Do you have any suggestions that you'd like to share on how to, I know we mentioned remote learning, so depending on what the student is, what their setup is going to be in the upcoming school year, for normalizing the conversation or that check-in moment to just say, how are you today? And, you know, creating that space.
So I like the idea of starting with some kind of question for the kids that is thought-provoking. I also like, and this takes a little bit more preparation, is for the younger kids, we tell them to create a backdrop for their remote learning. And so sometimes kids will like make tents out of their blankets, or they will, you know, arrange their pillows, or they'll make a drawing, or they'll sit with their animals, you know. So some of those things to really connect. And what it helps is it helps the teacher really see the environment the kid is in. So if I say to a child, you know, tomorrow we're all going to come and introduce our pets to the class. And if you don't have a pet, I want you to draw a picture of the pet that you would like and introduce him to us like you have a pet. So again, it lets me know, do children have animals at home? Do they not? Do they want one? You know, I can do, you know, if you were the teacher, what would you do for a day? You know, and ask questions like that to really begin to connect with them. Also, depending on their setup, they may not have privacy. So like I said, the younger children, because a lot of times adults are around them or older siblings, they like to use the chat box. So they will type in the chat box and they will communicate with me via the chat box, and I allow that to happen as well. But the check-in, check-outs are really important. You know, what was the best thing that happened to you today? What did you learn? What's your goal? Setting goals, even if they're little ones. Those are all good things to start in the morning. But the key is to engage the students. So if you can engage them, even on, you know, when you watch TV, what's your favorite program and who's your favorite character and why is that your favorite character? You know, that even gives you information about a child. You know, if they say, well, I watch, I don't know, I watch South Park, and my favorite character is Cartman because nobody bullies Cartman, or, you know, whatever. That gives you information about a child. So, you know, again, any of those questions that you can start off with to engage them. And then as the time goes on, I would ask the kids to come up with their own questions. You know, what question would you ask the group? What would you want to know? And give them all turns to ask a question. You know, on Monday, it's going to be Johnny's turn. And on Tuesday, it's going to be Sarah's turn. And on, you know, Wednesday, it's going to be Keon's turn. And on Thursday, it's going to be, you know, Ayana's turn. So again, I would, you know, give them some ownership in the startup as well. If that, and again, if anybody has a question and they don't want to ask it in public, you know, Kadi will put my email address in the chat box, and you can certainly email me. I do read my email and I do respond to questions if you'd rather ask a question in that forum, or if I'm answering the question and it's not exactly the answer you want and you need more clarification, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you. And then one last question I know I have is, how do we, I know since many districts are going into a remote platform, how is it best to practice the flexibility to, because some, as you already know, some students may have shared internet with parents if their parents are working from home, and not be able to meet all of the school assignments maybe by a particular time of the day. How can we practice a little bit more flexibility with the students so that they feel they're supported.
So that the internet usage has been a problem. It was at the end of last year. It will be again this year. So I think we need to be flexible throughout our school requirements, recognizing that there is going to be an overload on the internet. So sometimes I suggest that teachers give flexible due times for assignments. And the other thing is really, again, starting with the beginning of the year, your expectations. I expect assignments to be done, but I also understand that you're going to have some internet problems depending on where your house is and how many people on the internet. So I need you to be able to communicate with me if you are unable, or you think there's going to be a problem in getting an assignment done, or you think there's going to be a problem with your internet connection. I need you to communicate with me so we can figure it out. And we may need to modify those, but as much as we can do proactively is really helpful. So, you know, there are children who know that mom and dad are working at home and they've had internet problems last year, you know, and we need to identify that. When do you do your best work? You know, sometimes they will say, well, I can only be on the internet between 5 and 6:30 when mom is making dinner. And then I have the internet to myself and I'm able to do that. So then maybe we allow their assignment to be done between 5 and 6:30. You know, and then it's also working with the parents, you know, working with the parents to establish a schedule for when the child has availability to the internet. And if there's multiple children in the home, encouraging the parent or the guardian to establish scheduled times for all of those children to be able to get their assignments done. Typically, when I suggest that to parents, I suggest that the younger kids have the earlier hour because they usually have less work and need less time, and the older kids have the later hours because they usually stay up late and have more work to do. So again, being proactive and finding out which children are going to have some of those problems that we're going to run into, and then suggesting schedules and talking to parents about how that is going to get done and how it's going to be managed in their house. And maybe sometimes making suggestions for parents because they're struggling as much as we are.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. Sometimes the parents are struggling as much as the teachers, and especially if the teachers are also parents to small children themselves. And they're juggling multiple responsibilities. So we don't have any more questions at this time. So if you could please advance the slide to the QR code. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, we are a SAMHSA funded program, and our funding is very, very closely tied to our evaluation component. So we kindly ask that if you could, everyone please participate in our evaluation survey. We are required to obtain an 80% response rate from our participants. So you can either use the QR code that's on the PowerPoint slide on the screen right now, or I will also email all of the attendees here today a link to our GIPRA survey. And I will also include PJ's email. I've included it in the chat box. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today. I know it was a little early in the morning. And if you have any questions, either for PJ or myself, feel free to contact our center. And if there's no other questions, I don't see any submitted. We thank you for attending and being with us today.
Thank you very much, everyone. Stay well and healthy, and good luck on the start of the school year.
Thank you, PJ. Be well, everyone.